of the chaos that was August 1944, with German panzer columns racing westward in a desperate gambit to cut off American forces at Avranches. There was just one aircraft that could even hope of stopping them, and that aircraft was, well, it certainly wasn't supposed to be the Hawker Typhoon. You see, by every measure that mattered to the Air Ministry in 1941, the Typhoon was a disaster. An interceptor that couldn't intercept, a high-altitude fighter that gasped for air above 15,000 feet, an aircraft so plagued by structural failures that more pilots died from their tails falling off than from enemy action. Carbon monoxide leaked into cockpits, engines exploded on startup, the sleeve valves in its temperamental Napier Sabre engine wore out so quickly that mechanics joked you could time their failure with a stopwatch. The Air Ministry very nearly cancelled the entire program in 1942. They should have, really. On paper, the decision was obvious, but on the 7th of August 1944, as German tanks threatened to unravel the entire Normandy invasion, it was Typhoons armed with 8 3-inch rocket projectiles under their wings that made history. Not as the interceptor Britain desperately needed in 1941, but as something else entirely. This is the story of the Hawker Typhoon, an emergency solution that became Britain's most devastating ground attack aircraft, and perhaps the most accidentally successful warplane of the entire war. Even as the first Hawker Hurricanes rolled off production lines in March 1937, Sidney Cam was already thinking about what came next. Cam, Hawker's chief designer, possessed that rare engineering quality of being simultaneously pragmatic and visionary. He'd given the RAF the Hurricane, and he understood that by the time it entered service, it would already be obsolete in the minds of the Air Ministry. So in July 1937, Cam submitted preliminary designs for what he called the N and R types, 2 nearly identical fighters distinguished only by their power plants. The N would use Napier's experimental Sabre engine, a 24-cylinder H-block monster promising over 2,000 horsepower. The R would mount the Rolls-Royce Vulture, an equally ambitious X-block design. Both were technological moonshots, both promised speeds the RAF could barely imagine. The Air Ministry's response was cautious, enthusiasm, wait for the formal specification, they said, and by the way, we don't think your wing will be stiff enough. They were right to worry. In March 1938, specification FF.18/37 arrived. The requirement was extraordinary for its time, 400 miles per hour at 15,000 feet, a ceiling above 35,000 feet, 12 Browning machine guns. 2 prototypes of both designs were ordered, and on the 10th of July 1939, just weeks before war broke out, Hawker received a contract for 500 Vulture-powered Tornadoes and 500 Sabre-powered Typhoons. The names were assigned later. Tornado, Typhoon, destructive forces of nature, appropriate as it turned out, though not quite in the way anyone expected. The Typhoon's design married traditional Hawker construction methods with more modern techniques. The forward fuselage from engine mounting to cockpit used bolted and welded duralumin tubes covered with large removable panels, drilling for maintenance access. The rear fuselage was a flush-riveted semi-monocoque structure. In theory, this marriage of old and new should have produced a robust, serviceable fighter, but the wing. The wing. Camel designed the Typhoon with a NACA 22 section wing, 19.5% thick at the root, tapering to 12% at the tip. By contemporary standards, this was exceptionally thick. The Hurricane had used a similar philosophy, trading high-altitude performance for structural strength and internal volume for fuel and weapons. The Typhoon's wing could carry substantial armament, provided steady gun platforms, and incorporated 2 40-gallon main tanks plus 2 37-gallon nose tanks in the leading edges. It was also, aerodynamically speaking, a brick when the first prototype P5212 finally flew on the 24th of February 1940, delayed for months because Napier couldn't deliver a flight-ready Sabre. It revealed the problem immediately. The thick wing created enormous drag at high speeds. The Typhoon achieved 410 miles per hour at 20,000 feet. Respectable, certainly, but not the performance advantage the RAF had been promised. Above that altitude, the aircraft's performance fell off dramatically. Climb rate was disappointing. The thick wing section was creating exactly the problems the Air Ministry had predicted. And then on the 9th of May 1940, test pilot Philip Lucas discovered something far worse. At altitude, P5212's fuselage split. The join between the forward and rear fuselage just behind the pilot's seat began to separate. Lucas could see daylight through the crack. In an extraordinary display of nerve, he brought the crippled Typhoon down safely rather than bailing out. He was later awarded the George Medal. The engineers went back to their drawing boards, horrified. This was the Typhoon's baptism, an aircraft that couldn't reach its promised speed, couldn't climb effectively to high altitude, and had just tried to split itself in half mid-flight. And then Lord Beaverbrook, the Minister of Aircraft Production, ordered that resources be concentrated on just 5 aircraft types: Spitfire, Hurricane, Whitley, Wellington, and Blenheim. The Typhoon program slowed to a crawl. Development limped forward at reduced priority throughout 1940 and into 1941. The second prototype, P5216, didn't fly until May 1941, over a year after P5212's structural failure. This version carried 4 20mm Hispano cannon instead of 12 machine guns and would become the template for the production Typhoon Mark IB. But by mid-1941, priorities had shifted. The Battle of Britain had been won. The Blitz was ongoing, and the RAF was discovering to its considerable alarm that the Focke-Wulf Fe-190 was superior to the Spitfire Mark V in nearly every respect that mattered. Britain needed fighters, urgently, even deeply flawed ones. On the 27th of May 1941, Gloucester flew the first production Typhoon, just 3 weeks after the second prototype. The aircraft was rushed into service with 56 and 609 squadrons in September 1941, despite being fundamentally unready for operational deployment. What happened next was nearly catastrophic. If you were posted to a Typhoon squadron in late 1941 or early 1942, your life expectancy was measured not in combat missions, but in whether your aircraft would hold together long enough to complete a single sortie. The litany of failures was extraordinary. The Napier Sabre engine, for all its theoretical power, was a maintenance nightmare. Its sleeve valves wore rapidly, consuming oil at alarming rates. In cold weather, starting the engine became an exercise in controlled chaos. The sleeves fit so tightly in cold conditions that the Kaufmann cartridge starter often couldn't turn the engine over. Pilots were supposed to use oil dilution, adding petrol to the lubricant to thin it, but many pilots and mechanics weren't properly trained in the technique. Misfires during cold starts led to engine fires. Between 1944 and 1945 alone, 28 Typhoons were completely destroyed in engine starting fires. Then there was the carbon monoxide. Exhaust gases seeped into the cockpit with lethal persistence. Longer exhaust stubs were fitted in November 1941, and the port cockpit door was sealed shut, but the problem was never entirely solved. Standard procedure throughout the Typhoon's entire operational career was for pilots to use oxygen from engine startup to shutdown. Every single flight. The alternative was unconsciousness and death. The cockpit itself was unbearably hot. Ventilation tubes helped, but pilots often flew drenched in perspiration, breathing through oxygen masks in a shaking, howling machine that seemed determined to kill them, and then the tails started falling off. On the 11th of August, 1942, Typhoon R7692, with only 11 hours of flight time, suffered a catastrophic structural failure. The entire tail section separated in flight. The pilot, Hawker's second test pilot, Ken Seth Smith, was killed instantly. He'd been deputizing for Philip Lucas during a straight and level speed test. No violent maneuvers, no combat damage. The aircraft simply disintegrated. Sidney Cam and his team ruled out pilot error immediately. Investigation revealed that the elevator mass balance bracket had torn away, inducing violent flutter that ripped the tail off. It was the Philip Lucas incident all over again, but worse because this time they found a pattern. 25 Typhoons would eventually be lost to tail failures, 23 pilots killed. The solution was modification 286, 20 alloy fish plates riveted externally across the rear fuselage transport joint with internal strengthening of some frames. Between December 1942 and March 1943, every Typhoon without Mod 286 was grounded and modified, but even with the fix, tail failures continued sporadically until the end of the Typhoon's service life. In the first 9 months of operational service, more Typhoon pilots died from engine failures and structural problems than from enemy action. The Air Ministry began serious discussions about cancelling the entire program and replacing the Typhoon with the American Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. But something unexpected happened. The Typhoon found its purpose not at altitude, but down in the weeds. In 1941, the Fokker-Wulf 190 appeared over France and immediately established itself as superior to the Spitfire Mark V. Fast, well-armed, and brutally effective, the Fokker 190 began conducting tip-and-run raids, low-level, high-speed attacks on coastal targets in southern England. The Spitfire struggled to intercept these raids. The Fokker 190 was simply too fast at low altitude. The Typhoon, by contrast, was in its element. Below 10,000 feet, that thick wing wasn't a liability, it was an asset. The powerful Sabre engine gave the Typhoon straight-line speed that matched or exceeded the FW-190. The aircraft's sheer mass and structural strength, the very qualities that made it a mediocre high-altitude interceptor, made it a rock-steady gun platform at low level. Squadron leader Roland Beaumont of 609 Squadron recognized this immediately. Beaumont had worked as a Hawker production test pilot and understood the aircraft intimately. He pushed for the Typhoon to be employed in the low-level interceptor role, and his advocacy likely saved the program. During late 1942 and early 1943, Typhoon squadrons flew standing patrols at 500 feet over the south coast, with pairs of aircraft at immediate readiness. When the FW-190S came in low and fast, the Typhoons were there to meet them. On the 20th of January 1943, the Typhoon proved itself decisively. 28 Luftwaffe fighter bombers, escorted by fighters, attacked London in daylight, a bold, almost desperate gamble. The defenses were caught by surprise. The balloon barrage had been grounded, but 609 Squadron scrambled in time to intercept the raiders as they withdrew. Flying Officer Johnny Baldwin, who would become the top-scoring Typhoon pilot, destroyed 3 Messerschmitt Bf-109Gs in that single engagement. 3 other 609 Squadron pilots each shot down an FW-190. It was a massacre. The Typhoon's reputation as a low-level interceptor was established, but there was another problem. From certain angles, the Typhoon looked disturbingly similar to the F-190. Friendly fire incidents became common. British anti-aircraft batteries and RAF fighters shot at Typhoons with alarming regularity. The solution was distinctive markings, first all white noses, later high-visibility black and white stripes under the wings, a precursor to the invasion stripes that would mark all Allied aircraft on D-Day. By 1943, however, the strategic situation had changed. The RAF needed ground attack fighters more than interceptors. The Typhoon, with its powerful engine and robust construction, could carry 2 1,000-pound bombs, a payload equal to light bombers from just a few years earlier. In September 1942, 181 Squadron formed as the first Bombfoon unit. And then came the rockets. In September 1943, Typhoons began carrying 8 RP-3 3-inch rocket projectiles, 4 under each wing. Each rocket was essentially a 3-inch diameter cast-iron pipe containing a cordite motor and tipped with either a 25-pound armor-piercing warhead or, more commonly, a 60-pound high-explosive semi-armor-piercing warhead containing 17 pounds of explosive. The high-explosive variant proved far more effective against ground targets. The propaganda was extraordinary. The firepower of a single Typhoon equals a destroyer's broadside, claimed one report. By the end of 1943, 18 rocket-equipped Typhoon squadrons formed the backbone of the RAF's 2nd Tactical Air Force's ground attack capability. But the reality was more complex. The 3-inch rocket projectile was, to put it charitably, inaccurate. Pilots had to estimate range by eye, the rockets weathercocked after launch, aligning with the airflow, meaning any side slip or G-loading at the moment of firing created significant errors. A 20-mile-per-hour crosswind caused a 33-yard deflection at firing range. 4 degrees of side slip produced a 50-yard sideways error. The pilot pulling 2 Gs caused the rockets to impact 30 yards short. Operational research conducted in April and May 1944 concluded that under combat conditions, the 50% probability zone for rockets was 75 yards. That meant an 8-rocket salvo against a tank with a 200-square-foot profile had a hit probability of approximately 0.7%, less than 1%. But on the 7th of August 1944, none of that mattered. Operation Lüttich was Germany's last major offensive in the West. Elements of 4 Panzer divisions, 1st SS Panzer, 2nd SS Panzer, 116th Panzer and 17th SS Panzer Grenadier, launched a surprise attack westward toward Avranches, attempting to cut off the rapidly advancing American forces that had broken out from the Cotentin Peninsula. The attack began in pre-dawn mist, allowing the German armor to advance without air interference, and then, late morning, the mist cleared. Air Marshal Arthur Conyngham, commanding 2nd Tactical Air Force, made a simple decision. The Typhoons would deal exclusively with the German armored columns, while American fighters provided top cover and prevented Luftwaffe interference. The Typhoons were given a free hand to destroy the Panzer columns. Shortly after noon, Wing Commander Charles Green led 6 Typhoons on armed reconnaissance over the battle area. He reported a concentration of 50 to 60 tanks and about 200 other vehicles at St. Barthélemy north of Mortain. Within minutes, 2 squadrons from 121 Wing were airborne with rockets. They found the German columns packed on the roads, almost bumper to bumper. The Typhoons began by knocking out vehicles at the head and tail of each column, trapping those in between. Then they set about the rest. A shuttle service developed with fresh squadrons arriving at 20-minute intervals. For 8.5 hours, the Typhoons pounded the German columns without pause. That day, Typhoon squadrons flew 69 missions comprising 458 sorties, of which 294 were against targets in the Mortain area. They expended 2,088 rockets and 80 tons of bombs. The German advance ground to a halt. Werner Yusupate, an NCO with 2nd SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment, described the experience. The fighter bombers circled our tanks several times. Then one broke out of the circle, sought its target, and fired. As the first pulled back into the circle of about 20 planes, a second pulled out and fired. And so they continued until they had all fired. Then they left the terrible scene. A new swarm appeared in their place and fired all their rockets. Black clouds of smoke from burning oil climbed into the sky everywhere we looked. They marked the dead Panzers. Finally, the Typhoons couldn't find any more Panzers, so they bore down on us and chased us mercilessly. The Luftwaffe attempted to intervene. Over 100 Messerschmitt, 109 Essen Focke-Wulf 190S, sortied from airfields around Paris, but American fighters of IX Tactical Air Force intercepted them before they could reach the battle area. Not a single German aircraft got through. A second attempt later that day met the same fate. At 1740 hours, Luftwaffe Colonel von Scholz reported apologetically to 7th Army headquarters, "Our fighters were hard-pressed by enemy fighters from the moment they took to the air. They could not reach the target area." The XL-7 Panzer Corps daily report stated, "Continuation of the attack during the midday hours was made impossible because of enemy air superiority. The attack was bogged down since 1300 hours because of heavy enemy fighter-bomber operations and the failure of our Luftwaffe." Typhoon pilots claimed 84 enemy tanks destroyed, 35 probably destroyed, and 21 damaged. They also claimed 112 other vehicles destroyed or damaged. Post-battle analysis told a different story. Allied investigators found only 43 German tank hulks in the Mortain area. Of those, 19 were assessed as destroyed by ground anti-tank weapons, 7 by air-launched rockets, 2 by bombs, 4 by unknown causes, and 11 had been abandoned, intact, or destroyed by their crews to prevent capture. 7 tanks destroyed by rockets. Not 84, 7, but those numbers missed the point entirely. The effect on German morale was catastrophic. An RAF tactical report, based on prisoner interrogations, stated, "German tank crews are extremely frightened of attacks by rocket projectiles. Crews are very aware that if an RP does hit a tank, their chance of survival is small. It is admitted that the chances of a direct hit are slight. Nevertheless, this would hardly be appreciated by a crew whose first thought would be of the disastrous results if a hit was obtained." The German advance at Mortain stalled not because the Typhoons destroyed the tanks, but because they paralyzed the tank crews. Vehicles pulled off roads to hide under trees. Commanders lost the initiative. American reinforcements moved into blocking positions. The Mortain offensive, Germany's last chance to contain the Allied breakout, collapsed. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower said of the action, "The chief credit in smashing the enemy's spearhead must go to the rocket-firing Typhoon aircraft of the 2nd Tactical Air Force. The result of the strafing was that the enemy attack was effectively brought to a halt, and a threat was turned into a great victory." The Falaise pocket followed, as German forces attempted to escape eastward between August 12th and 21st. Typhoons harassed them relentlessly. Operational research sections found 667 German tanks and armored vehicles abandoned in the area. Of the 385 examined in detail, only 14, 3.6% were destroyed by rockets. 4 were destroyed by bombs, 21 by cannon or machine gun fire, but 269, 71% were either destroyed by their crews or abandoned undamaged. The Germans lacked fuel to move them. The Typhoons and other Allied fighter bombers had spent weeks systematically destroying the soft-skinned supply trucks that brought fuel and ammunition forward. No supply trucks meant no fuel. No fuel meant immobilized Panzers. The 3-inch rocket projectile, for all its publicity, was barely effective as a tank killer. But as a weapon of morale destruction and supply interdiction, it was devastating. By D-Day, 2nd Tactical Air Force fielded 18 Typhoon squadrons, 11 specializing in rockets, 7 in bombs. The Typhoon had become indispensable to Allied tactical air power, not as the interceptor it was meant to be, but as something the Air Ministry never anticipated, a flying artillery platform that shaped the battlefield through fear and disruption as much as through direct destruction. By October 1945, just 5 months after VE Day, the Typhoon had been withdrawn from frontline service entirely. Many squadrons were disbanded, others renumbered or re-equipped. The aircraft that had dominated the skies over Normandy vanished from operational service with remarkable speed. In total, 3,317 Typhoons were built, almost entirely by Gloucester Aircraft. Hawker had been too busy with Hurricane production to manufacture its own design in quantity. What was originally planned as the Typhoon Mark II evolved so extensively that it became a different aircraft entirely, the Hawker Tempest, with thinner laminar flow wings and significantly improved high-altitude performance. The Typhoon never solved its fundamental problems. Even at the end of its service life, pilots used oxygen from engine start to shutdown to avoid carbon monoxide poisoning. Tail failures continued sporadically. The Sabre engine remained temperamental and maintenance-intensive. In Normandy, dust stirred up by propeller wash contained over 80% hard, abrasive material that destroyed sleeve valves. It was calculated engines would last 3 takeoffs from forward airstrips before failing. Napier designed dome deflectors within a week. Those were soon replaced by drum-shaped filters that became standard as Modification 420. The aircraft killed 56% of all pilots who flew it operationally. 666 Typhoon pilots lost on operations. That casualty rate exceeded losses in Bomber Command, one of the most dangerous assignments of the entire war. And yet, Flight Lieutenant Ken Trott of 197 Squadron recalled, rather a large aircraft for a single-engine fighter. Terrific power, quite something to control. I liked it from the point of view of speed and being a very stable gun platform. You could come in on a target at 400 miles per hour and the thing was as steady as a rock. Squadron leader Des Scott, taking command of 486 New Zealand Squadron in March 1943, flew a Typhoon for the first time and wrote, "She roared, screamed, groaned and whined. But apart from being rather heavy on the controls at high speeds, she came through her tests with flying colors. I was drenched in perspiration and tired out." So that was it. The top-scoring Typhoon pilot, Group Captain Johnny Baldwin, claimed 15 aircraft destroyed in air combat between 1942 and 1944. Typhoon pilots claimed 246 Axis aircraft shot down during the war, a respectable tally for an aircraft that spent most of its career in the ground attack role. But the Typhoon's true legacy isn't measured in kill claims or even in tanks destroyed. It's measured in a more subtle currency, battlefield control. From the moment rocket-equipped Typhoons appeared in strength in late 1943, German armored commanders in the West operated under severe constraints. Major offensives were impossible during daylight, movement was restricted to night and poor weather. Supply lines were constantly interdicted. The psychological effect of Typhoon attacks, the howl of rockets, the thunder of 420mm cannon, the sheer noise and violence of the attacks was often more significant than the physical damage inflicted. German soldiers coined a saying, "If the aircraft above us are camouflaged, they are British. If they are silver, they are American. And if they aren't there at all, they are German." The Typhoon embodied that air superiority more than any other Allied type. The aircraft that nearly killed Philip Lucas in 1940, that killed Kenseth Smith in 1942, that the Air Ministry very nearly cancelled, that was too slow at altitude, too dangerous to start in cold weather, too prone to structural failure, too inaccurate with its rockets. That aircraft became 2nd Tactical Air Force's primary strike weapon. The aircraft German tank crews feared above all others, the weapon system that halted Operation Lüttich and shattered German armored resistance in Normandy. Today, only one complete Hawker Typhoon survives, MN 235, displayed at the Royal Air Force Museum in London. Several partial airframes exist in various stages of restoration, including RB-396, undergoing an ambitious rebuild to flying condition by the Hawker Typhoon Preservation Group. It's worth considering what might have happened had the Air Ministry made the rational decision in 1942, had they cancelled the program as so many recommended. Had they written off the Typhoon as a failed interceptor and moved on, the Battle of Normandy might have looked very different. The Morting counteroffensive might have succeeded. The psychology of German armored warfare in 1944 might not have been shattered by the sound of rockets and cannon fire delivered by aircraft their own fighters couldn't reach. The Hawker Typhoon wasn't the interceptor Britain needed in 1941. It was, quite accidentally, the ground attack aircraft Britain needed in 1944. A weapon system born from desperation, salvaged from near cancellation, and transformed through operational necessity into one of the most effective tactical aircraft of the Second World War. Not in spite of its flaws, but in a strange way, because of them. The thick wings that ruined its high-altitude performance made it stable at low level. The structural strength required to prevent it from disintegrating made it resilient against ground fire. The powerful, temperamental Sabre engine gave it speed and payload capacity unmatched by contemporary designs. Sidney Cam set out to design a Hurricane replacement. He created something else entirely, an aircraft that proved, perhaps more clearly than any other in the Second World War, that operational requirements evolve faster than aircraft development programs, and that success is often found not in meeting the original specification, but in discovering the mission nobody knew they needed. The Typhoon was Britain's emergency fighter, but it became Britain's most devastating tank destroyer. Not because it destroyed that many tanks, it didn't, but because it shaped the battlefield in ways that made tank warfare itself untenable for the Germans. That's a legacy worth remembering.